What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today, returning to the podcast, is N.T. Wright. That's right, he's back on the podcast talking about a brand new book he has out, looking at the letter of Ephesians, and it's a doozy. It's a doozy. I mean, it's a Tom Wright book, so, you know, it is both easy to read, weaving in a lot of scholarship with strong arguments for his own particular take, and we dig into a number of them here. It was great to get to talk to him again. It was hard to stay on topic of just Ephesians because since last we talked, he did the Gifford lectures, and I have a running set of things I want to talk to him about it. So hopefully, especially those of you that know him, say, hey, it was so cool to see you talk to Tripp again. Man, you know what I'd like? To talk to you, hear you talk to him about his Gifford lectures. But if you're going to be tackling the book of Ephesians soon, preaching in it, leading a group on it, you definitely want to check out his new book. I'll put a link to it right under this. And yeah, here you go. It's me, and it's Tom, and it's a good one. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast, I think for the fourth time, is N.T. Wright, though this time we are not on a rooftop in Malibu, so the view's not quite as nice as that evening, but you got a brand new book on Ephesians, and it was a doozy, because I got a message from your publicist, and they said, do you want to talk to Tom again next week? And I said, well, I guess I'm going to stay up late and read Tom's new book. So I may have had a dream last night about us talking about Ephesians, Tom. Okay. One of the places that might be fun to start is in the book, you spend some time arguing for Ephesians' Pauline authorship. And I have this problem, like a lot of theologians, is you kind of crystallize every other discipline other than your own from when you were in div school. And Ephesians and Colossians are on the all the people that know better know he didn't write it list. And the only other person I've read and go, oh, I hadn't thought about this, was Douglas Campbell. But he argues for Ephesians being perhaps the first and earliest letter of Paul. So I'd love for you to kind of take some time for people that take the biblical study seriously but may not be immediately up to date of like, what are the arguments and issues going on around authorship and where it might get dated in Paul's corpus?
I think what we have to recognize is that there are strong underlying traditions within the world of biblical scholarship. For years, those traditions were absolutely dominated by 19th century German liberal Lutherans. Now, unless I've missed something, there aren't any 19th century German liberal Lutherans still walking around, but their influence lives on. And they influenced not so much in Britain, and certainly not in France, where the majority of biblical scholars were Roman Catholics who were happy with the canon as it was, but particularly in America. And there's a kind of a transit across the Atlantic from Germany to America. And I have observed over the years young scholars who, whether or not they're writing about Ephesians or Colossians, they kind of have to repeat this mantra in order to as a sort of entry ticket to the guild. Oh, well, of course, this is Deutero-Pauline or whatever. And I've read quite a few of those things. When I was working on Colossians some years ago, I read a lot of those things. And they are very uneven, and they tend to repeat old arguments, etc. Underneath it all, I detect two or three things going on which make me think we can distance ourselves from these. And though I disagree with Doug Campbell about a lot, I mean, at least he's shown that by just rattling the cages very slightly, you can shift all kinds of things this way and that. And also, of course, Anthony Kenny, the great philosopher, who wrote a book based on stylometric analysis of the New Testament. This is going back 30 years ago now, which said that A, the sample is far too small to do a proper computer analysis of all Paul's letters. Doing all Plato's dialogues is one thing, but Paul's letters are tiny by comparison. But B, actually, stylistically, the variants are not so large as would suggest alternative authorship. And we have plenty of people in the first and second century writing on similar topics who write very differently. I mean, the letter to the Hebrews, which almost nobody now thinks was by Paul. It doesn't say it was by Paul. It's very similar topics in some ways, but very different style. And then you've got the letters of Ignatius, where, here's somebody in the very next generation, et cetera, et cetera. You see where that argument's going. For me, I'm speaking as a theologian, but also as a translator. having translated the whole New Testament and worked very closely through all the different letters, of course, word by word, looking up things this way and that, I have to say that in terms of style, the two most unalike letters in Paul's corpus are 1 and 2 Corinthians, because 1 Corinthians is kind of cheerful, and here's this topic, and this is what we say about it, and here's this, and watch out because of that. 2 Corinthians is gritty and jerky and awkward, and the sentences come out all sort of scrunched together. Because the guy, as he tells you in the first chapter, has just had a nervous breakdown, the style is radically different. And if I was starting with the question, can we distinguish Pauline letters according to style, those would be my numbers 1 and 2. But nobody thinks that 1 and 2 Corinthians were written by different people, except for some people who think 1 or 2 paragraphs in 2 Corinthians were. But here's the thing. The 19th century German liberal Protestants did not want high Christology, high ecclesiology. They didn't want high Christology because they were basically liberals wanting to be in the sort of the then mainstream. They didn't want high ecclesiology because they were Protestants who were opposed to Roman Catholics on the one hand, and, alas, to the whole Jewish way of thinking or Judean way of thinking on the other. And a lot of what they didn't like was the very, I mean, I now use the word Judean as a first century word rather than Jewish, but let's call it Jewish for the moment. The very Jewish flavor of both Ephesians and Colossians, where Paul, and I'm convinced it is Paul, is drawing on these great traditional things like the wisdom literature and prayer traditions and so on, in order to make a case which is deeply rooted in Scripture, very much in the way that Romans and Galatians are, but coming at it from a different point of view. I remember, again, going back 30 years now, Paul Aftermeyer, a great New Testament scholar at Union Seminary in Virginia, he wrote a commentary on Romans. I saw him not long after he'd finished that commentary, and he said, Tom, when I finished that commentary on Romans, I said to myself, the guy I've been describing writing Romans could have sat down the next day and written Ephesians. And I said, it's funny you should say that, because he had worked carefully through the argument of Romans and had seen that in all sorts of ways, this is very much cognate with Ephesians. Of course, the same scholars would want to push Romans 9 to 11 and Romans 12 to 16 off to the side somewhere. They mightn't say it wasn't by Paul, but they would say this was not really the heart of his thought. Guess what? Those passages point in all sorts of ways to Ephesians and Colossians. So that's the kind of shape of my argument for Pauline authorship. And then I want to say, let's read the text, for goodness sake, and see how it goes with everything else we know about Paul. And when we do that, as I've tried to argue in various places, problem disappears. It lingers on in American academe because there is this kind of tradition that if you do a PhD and you don't say that Ephesians was Deutero-Pauline or whatever, then the examiners might be cross, or they might chase you on it, or they might think you're a fundamentalist or something like that. It's as far as I'm concerned, I'm too old to play those games. Let's just be good first century scholars. Okay.
One of the things that at least I found helpful as a theologian who's written 2 books on Christology, so I kind of want to keep up with what we know about the New Testament. But I remember when I first read one of James McGrath's early books, looking at just how diverse, like the concepts of deity and monotheism and such were in Second Temple period Judaism. Oftentimes we have this kind of Protestant Christological arguments in our head, impose it back on Second Temple period, and then are uncomfortable with these various Christologies in the New Testament, when the diversity that's there is already in Judaism before you get to the Christ. And then when I was in Edinburgh, getting to spend time with Larry Hurtado and seeing just how the worshiping life of the early church is articulating a kind of responsiveness to a higher Christology. Is this prejudice bit and I mean, I get how it shows up in theologians, but isn't there an odd thing for theologians or the guild to feel the need to bear false witness against the text themselves? Because whatever they thought doesn't obligate you to believe it, but you should at least let Paul or,
but this is the thing, that for many Protestants, Paul is kind of the guru, that if we're anything, we are Paulinists, which then, of course, makes it bizarre because we've got lots of other books in the New Testament the ones called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for a start. And once you put this whole thing together, then the rather shrunken liberal Protestant reading, which gets more and more shrunken. I mean, I've watched this happen with people eliminating bits of Romans or Galatians or whatever. And it's just this is not good historical scholarship. This is certain types of theological prejudice read through the text. So when I look at this, I agree there are all sorts of hints of what we might call wisdom Christology or all sorts of stuff, but also things that have been, the way we've read them has been conditioned because so much Western Christian thought has been either aware of the danger of 18th century deism. So, we've somehow got to prove that Jesus was divine to show that the deists were wrong, or we're going the other way and we're showing that the deists had a point in case it be thought that we're just naive conservatives. And again, I'm too old to play those games. I just think, just like the 3rd and 4th century fathers were very worried about Arianism, which is why the Nicene Creed has a whole lot more very precise definition about Jesus' divinity than it does about his humanity. But in the New Testament, the humanity of Jesus, the use of Psalm 8, for instance, which is very strong in many passages, and which is all about what are human beings, and this is the status that humans have, and then applying that to Jesus, that's skipped over. And it's almost as though people are embarrassed by it. But for a full New Testament Christology, you've got to have those strands woven together, as you can do in different bits of the Jewish world, and as we certainly see in the New Testament. So I'm trying to be robust about this and say we've got to shed these nervous games that we play. And I've been to too many conferences and watched people get sort of shivers down the spine if somebody doesn't get this quite right. And that's just as much from liberals who are nervous about conservatives. And in America, this has to do a lot with political issues. The liberal thing will be assumed to go with a kind of a woke left position, and that the conservative thing, well, if you believe that Paul wrote Ephesians, you probably voted for Trump last time, or whatever it might be. Those may not be said, but they're kind of on the edge of the conversation. And speaking as a Brit whose politics is totally muddled, I mean, the British politics is completely chaotic at the moment. You would not be able to read anybody's politics off their exegesis or vice versa in my country. But I watch this happening in America, and America is the field leader. I mean, when I was young, it used to be Germany, but the torch has now passed to America, which is both good and bad.
Well, I'll just say that if someone was looking for Tom to make Paul partisan in the rather crappy political options alive in the current waning empire, they're going to be sorely disappointed. I think you would manage to infuriate anyone that any position on identity politics being normative for Christians problematic, and anyone that would think the allegiance to Jesus would have something to do with a nationalist commitment to ethnocentrist expression of their state problematic. But it's not. But what's fascinating, and one of the things I love about the way you capture the big picture of Ephesians, is that there's this thick connection that you play out throughout the whole book of capturing what's going on, where God's cosmic plan for the reconciliation of heaven and earth is brought into climax in Jesus the Messiah, and then demonstrated throughout the united, holy, missionary existence of the church. And so, like, the cosmic Christology of Ephesians generates a kind of cosmic eschatological ecclesiology that no nation or no tribe could, if they're honest, be comfortable with.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I was, just before we came on air, I was sorely tempted to be writing a letter to the London Times because one of their regular columnists, who I often read, was inveighing against contemporary multiculturalism and saying, this is just a silly agenda and it doesn't work, and here's why, blah, 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 blah. And I wanted to say, well, okay, secular multiculturalism is trying to get the results of the Christian vision without paying the price of allegiance to the gospel of Jesus. Because for Paul, in Galatians, there's neither Judean nor Greek, no slave nor free, no male and female. And Colossians, he says, neither barbarian nor Scythian nor this or that. And in the book of Revelation, you've got a great multitude from every nation and kindred and tribe and tongue. That's the New Testament vision. And here's the thing. Paul had seen that lived out on the street and in the actual church in Syrian Antioch before he ever went on his journeys. And he was determined to see that reproduced in church after church after church. Now, in Ephesians, you've got the mandate for that very clearly. In chapter 2, verses 11 to 22, it's so clear. Well, there's the new temple in which God dwells by the Spirit. So that coming together, as you say, of heaven and earth, chapter 1, verse 10, is to be instantiated in an actual community where previously irreconcilable, apparent opposites, ethnically speaking, come together in a new version, a new way of being human. And of course, as with many other features of the 18th century Enlightenment, the Enlightenment tried to get the results of Christianity without adherence to the gospel. Pope Benedict actually said that in his speech to the United Nations in April 2008. I was in New York at the time and was listening to it on the television. And he was absolutely right. And the trouble is that if you try to do that, you end up with a cacophony of special interest pleading, which just dissolves into chaos, which is the kind of Nietzschean anti-world, which is where we are in much Western would-be political thought right now. I could go on about this, but you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah. You mentioned there at the beginning of Ephesians, my family historically are primitive Baptist. So Ephesians is one of the letters that is just generally triggering because of what goes through some very bad sermons by people educated by the Holy Ghost alone and not going to the cemetery. When you get the opening, 3 chapters of a prayer, quite an intro, but at the beginning where you get so much of the language, blessed is us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, all the way down to kind of echoing the 1 Corinthians 15 resurrection stuff. And when I heard those texts so many times from elders in my family, kind of legitimating a hyper-Calvinist answer to the going to heaven question. And one of the things that you do by not taking the kind of definitely Baptist and generally Protestant kind of like selecting a verse to generate our theology is talk about how the entire question of salvation running through Ephesians is way too cosmic, too big, and too inclusive to be about parsing out who gets in and who gets out before the foundations of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I first did the lectures, which turned into this book, I got more and more excited because, as with my little book on Romans 8, which you probably know, Into the Heart of Romans, the more I went at it, the more it became clear, and I've got a big book coming out in February which expounds this in detail, that this is not about going to heaven. It's about being, as he says in Philippians 3, a colony of heaven here on earth. Now, that's not a colony waiting to go back to heaven, because the whole vision of the New Testament is God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, which is, after all, what Jesus taught us to pray. And so the way I would say it, and it's not just you Baptists, it's us Anglicans in our rather understated but still important ways as well, and so on and so on, that the whole medieval dream that the main thing is for our souls to go to heaven, which the reformers picked up and they adjusted the means by which you can get there, but they didn't adjust the goal. It was still, sooner or later, our souls have got to get to heaven. And they never really worked through how that fits with resurrection of the body. And I don't think that the great tradition from Thomas Aquinas really reconciled the soul going to the beatific vision with the resurrection of the body, because the resurrection of the body is biblical, but the soul going to a place called heaven and seeing God there simply isn't biblical, despite what Hans Bersma and others have argued at elegant length. So that Ephesians, very interesting when you see in that opening prayer, what does Paul say? He doesn't say God chose us before the foundation of the world in order that we could go to heaven. He chose us so that we could be holy and blameless before him. And that's an agenda for right now, because then again and again, and on into chapters 2 and 3, God chose those who are in Christ and indwelt by the Spirit in order to display to the world where they are right now who God is, that he's the God of grace and mercy and love and generosity, etc. And that comes out gloriously in chapter 3, verse 10, that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God, the many-colored wisdom of God, might be made known to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. In other words, Paul is not here talking about being chosen in order to go to heaven. That whole Calvinist or hyper-Calvinist dream is simply off topic. It's the church is there, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, to let your light shine before humans so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. It's the ancient Israel vocation that if Israel really is being the people of God, the first 12 verses or so of Deuteronomy 28 would say this, then not only will they be blessed, but the nations will look on and say, what an amazing God these people have got. That is the agenda which Ephesians is following through.
Yeah, I think the throughout Ephesians, you get so many uses of the word one and all. The idea that it's describing a cosmic event that partitions image bearers to demonstrate the holy love of God and eternal conscious torment just seems a bit convoluted as a means of exegesis.
There's nothing about eternal conscious torment in Ephesians.
But no, let's not go there. I remember in the first time I took a patristics class, reading Gregory of Nyssa's sermon on the one and all section, and it's here parroting, where you get echoes of the Philippians 2 hymn of the kind of kenosis into the resurrection of all and at the name of Jesus, that kind of stuff. And when he preaches a sermon on it, and he's just like, well, I think God ultimately redeems all things. I just remember I have a theological imagination that has been so occupied by that figure out how to go to heaven question that the dude that worked out how the relations of the Trinity work goes, look at this. The love of God revealed in Christ Jesus is one where the creators refuse to be God without us and will ultimately embrace all things. And you, my friends, get to be a part of enacting that love in the world. And I read it and go, well, I really hope I learn the name of Jesus because only a few don't get smited. And that's one of the things I loved about this book is it's precisely the higher cosmic Christology and the higher kind of cosmic eschatological ecclesiology that gives the church a very definitive and distinct mission in larger of a universal a desire for salvation on God.
Yeah,
on God's side.
I mean, I don't think Ephesians teaches what we have come to call universalism. I mean, that's universalism as we know it today is a very modern perception. Of course, some of the fathers were pushing in that direction, but it's very hard to sustain, granted all the stuff in the New Testament and granted biblical theology as a whole, in which God intends to rid the world at the last of all that causes evil. Now, if that involves redeeming all human beings who have caused evil, well, if God could do that if he wants, I don't see that written into the New Testament. And people who say, oh, well, in Romans 5, the word all means all. I'm sorry, that's a trivialization of the sort of argument Paul is mounting. But, I mean, let's not go there because that's not a major topic of Ephesians.
One of the things that Ephesians does do is, like in the same way in the 1 Corinthians passage, like what is becoming subject to Christ is sin, law, and death. Where's the action at? It's principalities and powers. Like these, and those are all ways of kind of getting at what keeps human beings in our life together from reflecting the very nature of the God who created us and invites us into the divine life. And I think that one of the problems of so much, especially Western theology, is like you said, like even Western universalism is arguing about individuals as opposed to arguing that the God who is love ultimately has that love reflected in a creation, and sin, law, death, principalities, and powers don't ultimately, kind of win in resisting the invitation to God.
That's fair enough. I mean, lots of us still go back to C.S. Lewis, and though I don't agree with Lewis on everything, partly because he was a Platonist, at least he was half Platonist at heart, you can see in various ways. Nevertheless, his vision in that remarkable little book, The Great Divorce, of a kind of anti-heaven, which is as close to being nothing at all as it could be, sort of the embrace of sheer nothingness, so that it's not in a position to blackmail what he calls heaven, the new creation. so that you can't have the idea of somebody saying, well, I'm not going to believe this, and the rest of you aren't going to be happy until I'm on board. So, suck it up, guys. That Lewis had seen the danger of that position and was taking very creative, imaginative steps to eliminate it. I think rightly. And I mean, it's funny because I do this podcast you may be aware of called Ask N.T. Wright Anything. And I groan when the question comes in yet again, how can I tell if my friends are going to hell or not? And so on. I think it's sort of, forgive me, it's a certain type of American with a certain type of background who asks that. Very few people in the UK ask that question, even if they've grown up in evangelical churches. They may have it in the back of their minds, but it's not the big issue. And certainly the holistic vision of Ephesians and the holistic vision of Romans 8 as well isn't about saying, these are the people who get in and those are the people who get out. It's about saying, look at what God is up to. He's in fulfilling the scriptures in Jesus through the Spirit. He's creating this new creation. And the church is to model and exemplify what the new creation is all about. That's why the mantra, which you'll have seen in the book, and it's kind of funny because when I did it as lectures, I did the lecturer's trick of having used the phrase 2 or 3 times. I would then start the phrase and look at the audience and they would respond. And the phrase is, the church is the small working model of new creation. And that vision of the church, I think, is just so exciting that then the question of, yes, but do they go to heaven and this, it becomes irrelevant. Of course, ultimate being with the Messiah, which is far better, that's Philippians 1, and ultimate bodily resurrection. That is enormously important and remains so. But not in the way that the post-medieval world has conceived it, even if it does go back to the Gregories, as you say. But they too were in danger of being certain kinds of Platonists, I think. I'm not a patristic scholar.
Well, I imagine they wouldn't even take that necessarily as a put down, considering
No, they wouldn't.
How genius they were at using his philosophical
But that's a
framework.
problem, because I'm doing a paper at a conference in a week or so, which I did a version of earlier in Oxford, from the New Testament to Nicaea. And there are all sorts of ways in which I want to say the New Testament absolutely supports Nicaea in terms of its Christology, etc., etc. But if you started with the Nicene definition, you would never guess that the person they're talking about, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, looked anything like this friendly, scary, funny, jokey, loving, highly significant human being that you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it's there where Jesus says, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. In other words, if you want the beatific vision, read John's Gospel. Now, that is a serious challenge. And I don't know if you've seen Mike Gorman's new book, which is bringing John and Paul together. That's a very, very interesting piece of work. And it might just be a game changer for how we read Ephesians, how we read all sorts of things.
Well, it's going to be very hard for me not to detour into all my questions about your Gifford lectures, which it's rare to have a book where you go from like underlining to then asking a question to then getting angry to be like, oh, I actually has a point and I got to rethink this. I love Gifford lectures. I think I've read most of them.
Good for you.
I would love to teach a class at some point that's just a seminar on Gifford lectures. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you went for it, like so many times when you get someone from other disciplines talking about, like the larger challenge of the Giffords, they don't go for it. But
I couldn't resist that. I mean, that's like a young fit man, like I might have been 50 years ago, being asked to join a party climbing Everest or something. So, okay, let's be up for this. It may be dangerous, but we're going to give it a go.
One of the things that I think could be helpful is, a part of what happens in chapter 1, like verses 20 to 23, is where you get that echo of 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection of the dead. And throughout your work, you've kind of been insisting that to understand what Christians mean by resurrection of the dead, you actually have to think you have to put on the Judean matrix that you talk about in the book. The resurrection of the dead is not the ascension of an individual soul into heaven, even though chapter 4 talks about the ascension of Jesus after the encounter with death. can you kind of help us understand how a Jewish reading of the resurrection of the dead is way too cool to be turned into an answer of the ascension of an individual?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tricky for us modern Westerners to understand just how the heaven-earth dynamic works in the Judean mind, or going back into the Tanakh, into Israel's scriptures, because the words heaven and earth are used both together and apart in such an interesting and interlocking variety of ways. But you can summarize it going back to Genesis 1 by saying that God intended a bipartite creation which was designed to be interlocking and overlapping, that heaven and earth were God's sphere and the human sphere, but that God wanted to share them together. And God's ultimate aim was to come and live with humans, so that it's the line at the end of the book of Revelation, Revelation 21, I think, verse 4, that the strapline is not now the dwelling of humans is with God. The strapline is the dwelling of God is with humans. That's the whole emphasis of the biblical theology as a whole, that the earth shall be filled with the knowledge and glory of God as the waters cover the sea. Not the earth will just disappear and some saved souls will go up and fly upstairs to heaven. That's precisely not what biblical theology as a whole is all about. No, I grew up in a world where people basically used to assume that the Old Testament was about land and family and this worldly stuff, and that Jesus came along and said, no, we're not doing this worldly stuff, and we're not doing all the legalism that goes with it. We believe in a spiritual world and love and grace and the kingdom of heaven, as in a place called heaven where you go when you die, and we don't need all that old legalism because God is a God of grace. That is a total travesty. The New Testament roots itself inch by inch in the world that Israel's scriptures and their Second Temple retrieval are talking about. It's just that if you put a crucified and risen Messiah into that world, it is explosive within that world. Not that you have to leave that world in order to get this middle Platonic or Neoplatonic spirituality, but that within that world, the cross and resurrection of Jesus mean what they mean as the fulfillment of God's desire to come and dwell with humans. And so the New Testament is saying this is what it looks like. And the passage about the Spirit in Ephesians 2, and indeed the passage you just referred to, that remarkable paragraph at the end of Ephesians 1, is about God doing by the Spirit, close up and personal, in believers and in the church, what God says in the Old Testament and bits in the New as well, he's eventually going to do for the whole world. Hence, small working model of new creation. God will flood the whole creation with himself. So at the end of Ephesians 3, when Paul prays that you may be filled with the fullness of God, I have watched particularly German exegetes twist and turn to avoid making the obvious connection with that Judaic promise about the world being full of the glory of God, and have tried to make it into some sort of Gnostic thing or something about a mythical idea called the pleroma, the fullness, as though that would enable you to do an exegesis of Ephesians without needing to draw on the Old Testament at all. I say, no, sorry, put it back in this Old Testament context and you'll see what's going on. This is where that whole story was supposed to land. Now, I've wandered slightly from your question, but it's just really important. I mean, one of the things I hope you enjoyed in that book was the passage on chapter 1, verses 15 to 23, where I was exploring the way in which the messianic vision of Isaiah 11, which is seldom drawn on by commentators on that passage, when you look and see, Paul is actually drawing on it to say, that's true of the Messiah, you are in the Messiah, therefore we're praying that will be true of you. Now, things like that were just a closed book to the older world of German exegetes, and tragically to many people, including many devout readers today.
That bit about picking up on Isaiah 11, it reminded me of Richard Hayes in the way when he's reading the Pauline letters, like the question of echoes is, I can't remember the image he uses, but a lot of times Protestants have this tendency of reading the New Testament, then finding something from the Old Testament and being like, See, as opposed to thinking like Paul or Jesus, who's like, these are the sacred texts. This is Torah.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
what does it mean to be a covenantal people that reenact it?
Exactly.
So like we are the echoes of Torah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Torah as this strange twisting and turning, but coherent narrative, which is plunging into the darkness of exile and what's going to happen next and where is Yahweh gone and will there ever be a Messiah and all of that. I'm lecturing on the book of Malachi in Wycliffe Hall at the moment. So all that stuff is very present to me. And the New Testament is saying, and you as a Christologist will appreciate this, that everything which was said about the return of Yahweh to Zion is now fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. And I know Larry Hurtado, may he rest in peace, disagreed with that. And Larry and I were good friends, but I persist in it because it's actually in many, many passages, both in Paul and the Gospels and Hebrews and Revelation. And likewise, the promise of the Spirit comes directly into that larger promise, which I've already quoted, about the earth being flooded or saturated with the presence or glory or knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. This is why I want to say, apropos the Gregories and Nicaea and all of that, that again and again, people who study patristics tend to say, well, the New Testament gave us some scraps of this and that, some rather sort of unsorted bits of dogma. And fortunately, the Cappadocians and others, they sorted them all out and it all got together at the end. As though the New Testament is kind of muddled and mangled and fragmentary. Anything but. Obvious example, the Holy Spirit. That I was taught that the New Testament never really sorted out whether the Spirit was divine or not. So it waited 3 centuries and then finally it got its due. No, in Ephesians, in Romans 8, in Galatians 4, the Spirit is playing the role of the tabernacling presence of God in the tabernacle in the wilderness or in the temple in Jerusalem. You cannot have a higher pneumatology than that. But they're trying to do pneumatology without reference to the whole Judaic and scriptural tradition. So no surprises, it appears fragmentary, but actually it was totally coherent. It's just they weren't looking in the right direction.
Do you think part of it is there's a difference between kind of recognizing the fidelity of the councils and in their context with the way they use language, the kinds of questions they ask in their age, we can recognize a fidelity to the tradition. But I think one of the problems is like after the fact, it so overdetermined the way we read the tradition.
Yeah.
Right? Like you mentioned earlier that over the councils, because we had Platonist questions, we kept adding on phrases to keep the humanity of Jesus. And then our answer to it is inventing a philosophical answer, the hypostatic union, which, every time it shows up in the New Testament, it's really clearly applied to Jesus. And then we look back and learn to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, as if this is what they really meant. When there's like a beautiful cacophony of different Christological affirmations that come from different parts of the church where they're asking different questions, and then they're canonized and as a way of going like, no, we trust the beauty and diversity and multiplicity of these texts. Like we literally have early church fathers saying, look, there's 4 winds. You got these different voices. And then later we go around going, well, we all know what Mark thought. He meant Chalcedon. And you're like, well, I don't know. And so to me, like part of the predicament of the way the creed functions is it then becomes like a lens to project on the text rather than a contextual affirmation of the trustworthiness of the tradition.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, because I've been lecturing on Malachi this term, but it's actually also I've got a book coming out, did I just say, called God's Homecoming, which is due out in February, in which all this is laid out much more fully than in the little one on Ephesians that we're officially talking about here. But there in Malachi 3, I will send my messenger before my face, and then the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Now, it's very clear in Malachi that the Lord, the Adon there, is Yahweh himself, because the whole of Malachi to this point has been saying, we've come back from exile, we've restarted the temple and the sacrifices, but Yahweh hasn't showed up. So we're all a bit bored. And And then, is he ever going to come back? And this is the direct answer to, is Yahweh going to come back? There'll be a messenger, and then the master himself will show up. And then watch out, because he's going to do this and that and the other. Now, Mark at the beginning, and Matthew and Luke at the beginning, and also in that passage about John the Baptist in Matthew 11, they quote these passages along with Isaiah 40, which is a very explicit prediction of Yahweh's personal return. And they put John the Baptist as the advance messenger, the voice in the wilderness, or the forerunner, whatever, which is as clear a way as you could have of saying that Jesus embodies Yahweh himself. Now, that is a great biblical and Second Temple Jewish way of affirming what then the philosophically minded fathers from 4 centuries later came round to. And I'm not disagreeing with them. I say the creeds ex animo myself, because if you ask the question that way, those are not bad answers to give. But any idea that those are the reality and that the New Testament way of doing it is just fragmentary and funny and needs cleaning up, that just shows we haven't yet learned to read. And I'm afraid that is part, going way back in our conversation, part of the implicit rejection of Judaism, of the Jewish ways of thinking, of Second Temple Judaism, etc. And we ought to have learned enough by now to know that that's not a healthy way to be.
Because when we started on discussing the uniqueness of understanding the resurrection of the dead within kind of Second Temple period Judaism, it reminds me, I was when the family and I went to Rome for the first time, and we were at the site where Caesar's murdered, right? And the tour guide is sitting there, and he goes, "Yep." And then the Senate gathered, and they all agreed that he ascended into heaven and became Son of God. Just like, you're a minister. It's like Jesus. And I looked at him with this face, like, do you want to ruin the tour for everyone? And I said, well, Jesus was raised from the dead. And he goes, yeah, like to God. And I goes like, no, he's raised from the dead. And anytime we try to draw it, just notice he's pulling Adam and Eve and all of creation up with him, right? Like, he didn't raise alone. It's not about an ascension to make him super special. It's about a revelation of the world's future. And the tour guide's like, all right. And we just got to move on.
Now let's go and look at some church where there's a statue outside or something. No, quite. But tragically, I have been to would-be Christian funerals where I've heard ministers say, as we believe that our Lord Jesus died and was raised to heaven, so we believe that our late lamented friend in the coffin here, having died, has been raised to heaven. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's not the point. That's not the gospel. And resurrection has been so downgraded in Western thought. And I have a whole riff on this, as you may know, that it's really partly the Enlightenment, that with the European and American Enlightenment, the whole philosophy of that was enlightenment. The world has been in darkness up until now, and at last the great light has shone, the light of reason, the light of John Locke or Rousseau or Thomas Jefferson or whoever. And so now we are proceeding on a whole new level. There is a new saeculum has begun. Novus Ordo Seclorum. I think it still says that on your banknotes, doesn't it? Something like that. A new order of the ages. It's a self-congratulatory quote from Roman poets, the time of Augustus. But so if that is so, there cannot be two climaxes of history. Therefore, the resurrection of Jesus must be just a metaphorical way of saying his cause lives on, or he's now with God, or something. So the downgrading, it isn't just about, modern science has just proved the resurrection, as if, everybody from Homer onwards knew perfectly well, that dead people don't come back. This is not a discovery of modern science. But people use that as a scare tactic, when in fact the real agenda is, therefore we, the enlightened ones, can push Christians off to the side and say, you're just one among many religions, so we're not going to worry too much about you, and we will now run the world the way we want. Now, how's that project been going, by the way? That's a good question.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
When I think of freedom and liberty and justice for all, I think we're really cresting right now, Tom. So there's one topic that comes in, well, a number, but I don't want to run too long. But on top of being a scholar, you've also had a number of different leadership roles in the church, and within the Anglican Communion, that means not just what a lot of clergy in the States manage of denominations trying to decide how to stay together or split up over different things and this kind of stuff, but it's a global community that's then part of a larger, the larger body of Christ. And I wonder what about your pastoral experience and leader, the challenges you faced as a leader within the church are most like what's the word in Ephesians about this cosmic eschatology that shapes our ecclesiology? How did that most challenge what you thought your task was within church life?
A lot of what I've done since leaving my last big pastoral job, where I was Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010, it was only 7 years. So that's now 15 years ago that I left that and went back into the academy. So a lot of what I would now regard as some of my more important insights, if I can say it like that, have come since then. I mean, I wrote the Gifford Lectures since then. There was no thought of that when I was in Durham. And the little book on Romans, this little book on Ephesians, and the book I did recently on Acts, these have all grown out of subsequent thought, but subsequent thought informed by the puzzles and difficulties that I was trying to address when I was being first a dean, then a bishop in the Church of England. So it isn't so much that I was doing this great biblical thing and then trying to make it happen. Rather, it's the other way around, that for years I was bumping my head against the real problems of church communities, of holding people with apparently wildly different views together, if that could be done. And particularly, what Paul is talking about, maintaining the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace.
In Ephesians, Paul has this cosmic ecclesiology where you talk about God's richly varied wisdom is made known to the rulers, authorities, and heavenly places through the church. It's a sign to the powers of the world that they're not ultimate and these kinds of things. And yet so many of our church life questions are invitations to perform divisions set by our larger society. So thinking back to your time in church leadership, what's going on in Ephesians that might be most provocative, challenging, or inviting?
The way I say it, I can't remember if I say it in this book or not, but it's something I do say quite often, is that Paul again and again is pushing for two things, unity and holiness. And unity is easy if you don't care about holiness, because you just stick together as one happy family and you ignore all the things where you actually disapprove of what these people over here may be doing. But holiness is easy if you don't care about unity, every time you have a disagreement, you simply split off and do your own thing. And of course, that's what's happened in many parts of Western Protestantism, particularly in America, but also in Africa and elsewhere, where people have gone off and done their own thing, partly excusing it with questions of behavior, but also questions of doctrine and dogma, and alas, often implicitly questions of ethnic identity. And the Paul who wrote Ephesians will be horrified by that. The whole point of the church is we're doing this stuff together, guys. So that I see that opening paragraph in Ephesians 4, 1 to 16, as really seminal, because you've got all these different ministries. Now, if we had all those ministries in the same parish here, I would really worry, if I was the senior pastor, that they're all going to go off and do their own thing, and we're going to have a real problem coordinating and bringing them together. And so Paul insists God gave these many gifts to his church to serve the unity of the body as a whole. And then that unity is to be sustained through this extraordinary ethical vision in 4:17 onwards, right into 5, which is about kindness and forgiving and mutual hospitality and love and respect and so on. And when I think of Christian ethics, if you say that phrase, Christian ethics, many people immediately think of either sex or money or something. Well, sex and money are important, but actually for Paul, kindness and forgiveness and gentleness and so on, these are absolutely central. And we need to preach more about that stuff, because in the church as a whole, people tend to think that because we're Christians, the way we see things must be right. So these people over here who are getting it wrong, we need to put them straight. And we're not very good at doing that, actually. So that there's a sort of modus operandi, question of how we go about church unity, and which I think a good plunge into Ephesians 4 and 5 would really help with. Though, of course, it's bracing stuff. I mean, there are big challenges there, and I've tried to spell some of them out in this book.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed in the way you're unpacking Ephesians is there's kind of different, it's like a nesting dolls of kind of the way the mystery of new creation moves. And it moves from this macrocosmic sense at the beginning down to what you call the theological climax, the section in Ephesians that is most uncomfortable for mainline Protestants, the marriage section. And you say that it's the theological climax of the letter, serving as a signpost to new creation. If the mystery of marriage is the relationship between the Messiah and the church, what dangers exist if the church focuses solely on the ethics of marriage without grasping the cosmic new creational symbolism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that's so important, that two stages really in the way we've misdone theological education. First, within Protestantism, we've so focused on justification by faith, without works. So please don't do any good works, because that might tempt you to think that you're earning your salvation. That's a total misunderstanding of justification. And by the way, the good works in Ephesians 2:10 are not good ethical behavior, though Paul takes that for granted. They are the good works, as in Titus, as in Matthew 5, etc., which are the things the church is called to do in and for the world, to demonstrate to the world who the Creator God really is. So having said that, what we've done is we've separated off ethics from the main thing, the doctrine of salvation, how you get to heaven. Ethics is, well, yeah, that's important, but not that important. And that was a major mistake. But then within that, we have separated out different ethical issues, as though here's some stuff about money and tithing or whatever, and here's some stuff about marriage and sexuality, and here's some stuff about, I don't know, relations between different people groups and so on, as though they're quite separate. For Paul, it's all part of the same thing. And the fact that he earths or grounds the marriage section there in Ephesians 5, in Genesis 2, shows what's going on, that he's had Genesis 1 and 2 in mind all along, and he's seeing it, the fulfillment of God's purpose in creation, literally fleshed out in the one flesh of marriage. Now, it's ironic because, I said at the beginning of this interview that it used to be the case that people tried to say Ephesians wasn't Pauline because of its high Christology and ecclesiology. But latterly, some scholars have said the main reason for denying Ephesians to Paul is that chauvinistic stuff about marriage, because the Paul I believe in would never have said that. Well, sorry, this is Paul thinking theologically. And I always have to say, when I talk about this, you have to balance out what he says in Ephesians 5 with 1 Corinthians 7, where he highlights the appropriateness of the single vocation, lest people should imagine that in order to be a true Christian, you really ought to get married. Paul himself is unmarried. Jesus was unmarried. Singleness is a great vocation for those to whom it's given. But so having said that, then these great waves from 1:10 through 2:11 to 22, through the end of 3, through the unity of the church in 4, it's all moving towards this sign. And in Paul's world, this is just absolutely massive in a world where casual sex was easy, divorce was easy, etc., to say, no, the coming together, the self-giving coming together, where he appeals to husbands to love their wives as the Messiah loved the church, which is he gave himself for her. So the husband's actually giving up rights, hopes, privileges, whatever, for the sake of the wife. And of course, that creates a context within which the wife has to have respect for the husband, etc. But Paul knew perfectly well that if there's a couple like that living next door to you in, say, Ephesus or Corinth or Philippi or wherever, people will notice that there's something different here, and they will wonder about the God who is there being modeled and displayed. And that's the thing. This is not a restrictive or chauvinistic image. It's about modeling new creation. And I speak as somebody who's been married for 54 years. This is not easy. You have to work at it. There are turns and twists in the relationship, etc., etc. But it does say something. It communicates something to the world around, something which is irreplaceable in terms of the witness of the church overall.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've had a similar conversation with a number of Christians who are trying to kind of get over a rather narrow vision of their faith and such. And oftentimes, especially in America, my experience in Scotland is this is not true, but in America, the more often you read the Bible, the earlier you get married. And the more likely you have some issues with purity culture. A few weeks ago, I have a group of young clergy that we get together and talk. And one of them was sharing about how their partner's experience with purity culture, and they're deconstructing their faith and going through this whole, like, I was handed certainty, finality, it's breaking apart. And they're trying to, having this identity crisis. And now his partner's like not sure about participating in the church that he's a clergy at. And he's sitting there going, what does it look like to practice that self-giving mutual submission when you don't want to forsake, right, the larger, more beautiful account of the gospel, but you also don't, the last thing you'd want is to coerce someone to agree with you, but they have to have their own, process and that kind of thing. So like if in that larger container of marriage where this mystery is being enacted, what does it look like for people who maybe found their relationship at a time where their faith looked one way and are dealing with trauma that maybe where they found their faith is generating it in different directions? Like, what's it like? Like, what's the pastoral advice for people in that situation?
Wow.
So I can steal it, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a toughie. And as I've said on numerous podcasts, I can't be anybody's pastor at long range. I can't be a pastor when there's only a camera sitting in front of me. And I know from experience that there are as many different approaches to the sort of question you addressed as there are couples or indeed individuals out there, so that very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all. And I would want to say anyone who's having any problems like this, please find a wise pastor, a humble but experienced pastor with whom you can pray and laugh and cry, and with whom hopefully you can find ways forward. Because yes, I totally get it that many young Christian couples, certainly when Maggie and I got married, which was in 1971, we were both very idealistic young Christians, both been quite well taught through our teens, etc. And it was all going to be fine, wasn't it? And quite soon we realized just how different we are. It was only really when we did things like the Myers-Briggs thing and the Enneagram that we actually found names for the ways we were significantly different. And then you can kind of begin to lighten up and say, well, of course we do that differently because we just got different personalities. And then to work through that at what would further shared Christian maturity look like, and to find and relish and build on the places where you do come together as Christians. There are some Christian activities like an early Sunday morning Eucharist, which I love, have done all my life. My wife just can't do that for various health reasons. She can't get up early in the morning. But we both love going to, here in Oxford, the service called Choral Evensong. We live right across the street from New College, which has one of the most wonderful choirs in the world. And to sit with my wife and just to enjoy singing the hymns and listening to the psalms being sung, etc. That has a profundity now, which it wouldn't have done 50 years ago. But it's as though there are moments when we can bring all the different things that we are and just kind of link arms or hold hands and without necessarily spelling it out, say, we're in this together. And this is this larger, hard to name world of the love of God in Christ and by the Spirit and in community. But I'm not saying it's going to go on like that for the next 5 years. It might or it mightn't. We're old now, so who knows how long we'll be here. But the reality, the theological reality, is something that the church must affirm and then constantly work towards. Like everything else in Ephesians 4 and 5 and 6, we affirm it and then see it as a goal which we need pastoral help in order to advance towards.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. The last question I have is something stuck out to me after I finished your book and then reread Ephesians this morning.
Okay.
And I wonder how you would think of Ephesians speaking to the Advent season that we're about to come into. The big cosmic picture has this whole kind of cosmic dialectic between, the submission energy of us and embodying the Christ and this cosmic picture that's going on. Like when you think of the Advent season we're about to begin, what is the invitation to Advent that you can see in Ephesians?
Yeah, I mean, Advent is the place, I'm sure you know this, where the church's year overlaps itself. The church's year is actually effectively 13 months long because at the beginning of the church's year, Advent, we're looking forward with Israel's scriptures to the arrival of the Messiah. But then when we get to the end of the narrative, we're looking forward to the return of the Messiah. There's not very much about that in Ephesians, but it's kind of on the edge because it's obvious that we're not there yet, but that's the promise, and the promise that you will be filled with the fullness of God against the day when the whole earth will be filled with the fullness of God. But at the moment, Advent is marked by the puzzle and the darkness of the ongoing struggle, and that's where Ephesians 6 comes in. And I would love to see Ephesians 6:10 to 20 as a major Advent text, because this picks up from, you've said this 2 or 3 times, from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 to 28, where Paul says he must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet. So the sense of Jesus already reigning, that's the kind of Advent Mark 1. But then until he's put all his enemies under his feet, that's Advent Mark 2. And in between is where we now are. So the Sundays in Advent might well be marked by meditation on our role as people defending, holding the line. The point is not that we have to win extra victories. Jesus has won the victory. All the armor that Paul lists, other than the sword of the Spirit, are defensive pieces of armor. Our task is to hold the line because of the counterattacks, and to try to understand the Advent, the oddity of Advent, the overlap of the ages, if you like, in terms of the church's vocation to hold on to and defend by our own integrity, etc., the victory that's already won. That will be a marvelous innovation. I don't expect to see it anytime soon, because those who organize church calendars and so on don't seem to pay much attention to what we biblical scholars say. Maybe one day.
Well, there you go. Before the eschaton, they're going to invite biblical scholars in.
Wouldn't that be
to
nice?
The church calendar. Well, thank you so much, Tom. It was
great
to reconnect. And at some point, I'd love to talk about the Gifford lectures. It was really hard to avoid discussing them because the relationship of Revelation and history is its own conversation.
Absolutely. Good. Very good to see you again.
Am I correct? You have a grandkid that's in the choir at Oxford for Evensong?
How did you know that? Yes, but it's true. Yeah.
Maybe Bethany mentioned it.
Oh, possibly. No, my son Oliver, my youngest son, gave up being a lawyer after 14 years, trained for ministry, did well, has now got himself a PhD just this last year, and his son Leo, who is 9, is a little choir boy singing in that choir, and that's a great delight. I mean, Oliver himself, my son, sang in that choir when he was that age, and they're now still living in Oxford, are following his seminary days, and so to be able to walk across the street and see this grandson as a chorister, that's very special. I'll show you if the camera will pick this up.
Oh yeah.
There he is.
Oh wow!
Surplice with the director of music beside him.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and this last Sunday they were singing Charles Stanford's version of the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis in A. And he said to us before, it's Stanford in A this Sunday. In other words, I know you'll enjoy this. And sure enough, we go in and we're sitting there and they sing this amazing stuff and he's hitting the high notes. And then at the end, he turns around and just gives us a very slight cheeky grin as though to say, I know you enjoyed that.
Oh man,
The
you hit the grandfather lottery right there.
Oh yeah,
you even sung with your wife while your grandkid sings. That might keep you every time the choir's in session. It might keep you from going back to Scotland until they take time off.
It works well because they sing during term, and we're here most of the time during term, and then we'll go to Scotland during the vacation when they have time off. So at the moment that works. That may not last forever, but it's a good moment.
Awesome. Well, you have a great day, and thank you for all that you've given both to the Academy and the church.
Thank you very much. All the very best.